Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a city on the edge of something vast. Tehran, 1953. The sun has barely risen, but in the shadowed streets, something is shifting. A man tall, fragile, and uncompromising paces the floor of his modest home. His name is Mohammad Mossadegh. He is the elected Prime Minister of Iran, and today, history is hunting him. But to understand this day, we need to go back, not just a few years, but through oil fields, royal palaces, colonial boardrooms, and Cold War fears. Because this is the story of how the United States and Iran became sworn enemies. And it starts not with missiles or hostages, but with oil and a coup. Before Iran was Iran, it was Persia, a land of kings, empires, and poetry. For thousands of years, it stood tall, independent, and proud. But by the early 20th century, Persia had become a prize in a much larger game. In 1908, a British company struck oil in the southwest. Not just any oil, the richest reserves ever seen. Suddenly, Britain had the fuel it needed to power its navy, and it formed the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, the same company that would eventually become BP. The deal, utterly one-sided. Britain kept nearly all the profits. Iran, the landowner, the host, the laborer, received just a sliver for decades. Iranians watched their wealth flow abroad while their people lived in poverty. Resentment fermented slowly, like pressure building beneath desert stone. Enter Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh, a nationalist, a lawyer, a statesman who believed in Iran's right to govern itself. By 1951, he was appointed Prime Minister, and his first act was seismic. He nationalized Iran's oil industry. He expelled the British. He declared that Iranian oil should benefit the Iranian people. The streets of Tehran erupted in celebration, but in London, fury, and in Washington, something worse, fear. It was the early Cold War. America's worldview was binary. Either you were with the West, or you were with Moscow. And Mossadegh, he wasn't with either. His independence, his talk of socialism, and his willingness to let Iran's Communist Party, the Tadeh, operate, made him look dangerous. To Britain, Mossadegh had stolen their oil. To America, he might hand it to the Soviets. And so, in secret, the two old allies, Britain and America, crafted a plan. A plan to remove a man elected by his people. The mission was codenamed Operation Ajax. President Eisenhower gave it the green light. The CIA sent a young operative to Tehran, Kermit Roosevelt Jr., the grandson of Theodore Roosevelt. His job? To stabilize the Mossadegh government from within, bribe Iranian generals, fund street protests, plant fake stories in the press, paint Mossadegh as a madman, a traitor, a communist. On August 15, 1953, the first coup attempt failed. The Shah, young, anxious, and unsure, fled the country. It seemed the plot had unraveled, but Roosevelt stayed. He regrouped, and just 4 days later, August 19th, the streets of Tehran exploded with manufactured chaos. protesters, some paid by the CIA, clashed in the streets. Army tanks turned their barrels. Mossadegh's home was surrounded, then bombed. By nightfall, the prime minister had been arrested, and Iran's fragile experiment with democracy had ended. The Shah returned to Iran within days. He was all smiles for the cameras. But make no mistake, he ruled now with a leash handed to him by the CIA, the US, and Britain got what they wanted: access to oil. A pro-Western leader, a new agreement to split Iran's oil revenue this time, with American companies getting a share. But the Iranian people saw something else. They saw their elected leader crushed. They saw foreign hands controlling their destiny. And they saw a monarch ruling with SAVAK, his secret police trained by the CIA and Mossad, torturing and disappearing dissenters in the dark. To many Iranians, America was no longer a symbol of liberty. It was now the puppet master behind their pain. What happened in 1953 didn't just change a government. It planted seeds. Seeds of bitterness, of suspicion, of fury. And when they bloomed more than 2 decades later, the world would watch in horror as the US embassy was stormed, as American hostages were paraded blindfolded through Tehran, and as a once quiet enemy emerged in full view. "1953 was a success for Washington. The Shah was back in power. The British regained access to Iran's oil, and the CIA had pulled off its first major foreign coup. But victories built on deception don't stay victories for long. In the years that followed, the United States poured money, arms, and advisors into Iran. They hailed the Shah as a modernizer, a stabilizing force in a volatile region. But beneath the polished marble palaces and Western applause, a fire was building. Because the Shah wasn't just a ruler now, he was a symbol to his people. He was the crown on a puppet, a man who owed his throne to foreign hands. In the 1960s, the Shah launched the White Revolution, a sweeping campaign of reforms. Land redistribution, women's voting rights, massive investment in education and health. On paper, it looked like progress, but in practice, it was uneven. Many rural Iranians, especially religious conservatives, saw it as an attack on Islamic tradition, and it made enemies out of 2 powerful groups: the clergy and the poor. Meanwhile, political dissent was crushed, students were jailed, writers were censored, and the secret police, SAVAK, grew notorious for their brutality interrogations, wiretaps, torture chambers. By the 1970s, Iran looked like a modern state, but it felt like a pressure cooker. And in exile, one voice was rising louder than the rest. His name was Ruhollah Khomeini, a cleric, a scholar, and a fierce critic of the Shah. In 1963, he was arrested for condemning the regime. By 1964, he was forced into exile. But even from abroad, first Iraq, then France, his influence grew. Cassettes carrying his sermons were smuggled into Iran. They spread like wildfire. His message was clear: the Shah is corrupt. The West is meddling in Islamic lands. True leadership should be religious, not royal. And then, in 1971, the Shah made a critical mistake. He celebrated 2,500 years of Persian monarchy with an extravagant festival in Persepolis. Foreign dignitaries dined under crystal chandeliers in the desert, while millions of Iranians lived in poverty. The spectacle cost more than $100 million. It was meant to glorify Iran. Instead, it ignited disgust, and the cracks in the regime deepened. By the late 1970s, protests against the Shah had become unstoppable. What began as student demonstrations in Tehran escalated into a nationwide movement. Religious leaders, secular liberals, Marxists, bazaar merchants, they all wanted change. Their visions differed, but their enemy was the same. On January 16, 1979, the Shah left Iran claiming it was a vacation, but few believed he would return. And he never did. Just 2 weeks later, on February 1st, a chartered Air France flight touched down in Tehran. Out stepped Ayatollah Khomeini. Greeted by millions, he had returned from exile, not as a rebel, but as a revolutionary leader. The Islamic Revolution had arrived, and America, it was about to face the consequences of its past. Later that year, the Shah, now in exile, was admitted into the United States for cancer treatment. To American officials, it was a humanitarian gesture. To the Iranian revolutionaries, it was a provocation. They feared the US might try another coup. Another 1953. On November 4th, 1979, Iranian students stormed the US embassy in Tehran. They seized more than 60 American diplomats and staff. The world was stunned. For 440 days, those hostages were held, blindfolded and bound. Night after night, American television screens were filled with images of fear and fury, chanting crowds, burning flags, death to America. President Jimmy Carter tried diplomacy. He tried a rescue mission. It failed disastrously, and across Iran, the message was clear. The days of US interference were over. The hostage crisis reshaped US-Iran relations forever. Washington cut diplomatic ties. Economic sanctions followed. A deep, mutual distrust set in. Khomeini solidified his rule, creating a theocratic government under the principle of velayat-e-faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist. Iran was no longer a monarchy. It was an Islamic republic, and America had become its primary adversary. Meanwhile, the US threw its support behind a new partner, Saddam Hussein in neighboring Iraq. And in 1980, when Saddam invaded Iran, launching a brutal war that would last 8 years, America backed him covertly. That war would kill over 1 million people. But the hostility between Iran and the US, it only deepened. This isn't just the story of two countries who disagree. This is a story of broken trust, of foreign plots and rising nationalism, of oil, ideology, and revenge. The seeds were planted in 1953. They bloomed in 1979. And their shadow still hangs over every negotiation, every standoff, every tense glance between Washington and Tehran, because history doesn't vanish. It waits and watches. By the end of the 1980s, Iran was a nation transformed by war. The Iran-Iraq War, ignited in 1980, left entire cities in ruins, children as soldiers, and chemical weapons staining the air. It was a catastrophe, 8 years of trench warfare that dragged Iran back into the past while hardening the present. And behind the scenes, the United States played both sides. While publicly denying involvement, US intelligence quietly helped Iraq. Satellites shared Iranian troop movements. Dual-use technology was sold to Saddam. And when Iran began gaining the upper hand, America shifted its support even further. It wasn't about loyalty. It was about strategy. Contain Iran, block Soviet influence, protect oil. But Tehran never forgot, and the mistrust turned into open hatred. The 1980s weren't just about bullets and bombs. They were about secrets. In 1985, a new scandal erupted, one that dragged Iran and the US back into a strange dance of contradiction. The Iran-Contra affair. While Iran was publicly branded a sponsor of terrorism, the Reagan administration was secretly selling them weapons. Why? Because Iranian operatives had influence over Hezbollah, who had taken American hostages in Lebanon. And those weapons sales? They generated funds that were then used illegally to support anti-communist rebels, the Contras. In Nicaragua, when the truth came out in 1986, it rocked the US government. Congress held hearings. The Reagan administration teetered. But for Iran, it only confirmed what it already believed. America cannot be trusted. After the Iran-Iraq War ended in 1988, Iran turned inward. It rebuilt. It buried its dead. And it watched as the world shifted again. In 1991, the US launched Operation Desert Storm, pushing Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. American troops flooded the Gulf. Military bases sprouted in Saudi Arabia, home to Islam's holiest sites. For Iran's leaders, this was another red flag. The US was no longer a distant enemy, it was now at its doorstep. Domestically, Iran began transforming too. Ayatollah Khomeini had died in 1989, replaced by Ali Khamenei. The new supreme leader, Iran's conservative clerics tightened their grip. Meanwhile, moderate politicians like Mohammad Khatami tried to open the country to the West during the late 90s. There was even talk of dialogue, a dialogue of civilizations, Khatami called it. But in Washington, hardliners had little interest in forgiveness. And in Iran, conservatives weren't ready to forget the past. The window closed. Then came September 11th, 2001. 19 terrorists for hijacked planes. Nearly 3,000 dead. None of the hijackers were Iranian. In fact, Iran condemned the attacks and even quietly cooperated with the US in Afghanistan, helping to remove the Taliban. But it wasn't enough. Just 4 months later, in his 2000 State of the Union address, President George W. Bush stood before Congress and said these words: Iran, Iraq, and North Korea constitute an axis of evil. And just like that, the thaw froze solid. Iran was again cast as the villain. Sanctions returned. Diplomatic channels were slammed shut. And inside Iran, hardliners used the speech to silence reformers, claiming, "See, The West will never accept us. Throughout the early 2000s, Iran began expanding its nuclear program. It insisted the program was peaceful, meant for energy, not warheads. But the world wasn't convinced. Satellite images showed underground facilities, uranium enrichment sites, a growing number of centrifuges. The US, still reeling from Iraq, couldn't risk another war. But it also couldn't ignore the threat. So instead of invasion, Washington turned to economic warfare. Heavy sanctions were imposed targeting Iran's banks, oil exports, and foreign assets. The Iranian economy buckled. Inflation soared. The currency collapsed. For ordinary Iranians, life became a daily struggle. And for the regime, the pressure only made it dig in deeper. In 2015, a sliver of hope emerged after years of tense negotiations. Iran and 6 world powers, including the US, signed the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the Iran nuclear deal. Iran agreed to limit its nuclear activity, allow inspections, and reduce enrichment. In return, sanctions were lifted. Billions in frozen assets were released. Trade opened. For the first time in decades, it seemed like a breakthrough. But the agreement was fragile. Many in America, especially conservatives, called it a mistake. And in 2018, under President Donald Trump, the US withdrew from the deal. Sanctions were reimposed. Tensions skyrocketed. Iran resumed enrichment, and the cycle resumed, this time closer to the brink than ever before. It's a story of missed chances, of moments where peace flickered, then vanished. Each act of betrayal fueled the next. Each retaliation gave birth to another. And at the heart of it all then and now is a question that refuses to go away. Can these two nations ever trust each other again? By the end of the 2010s, the relationship between the United States and Iran wasn't just cold, it was volatile. After President Trump withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal in 2018, the US pursued a campaign called Maximum Pressure. Sanctions were sharpened. Iran's oil exports plummeted. Its banking system was suffocated. And the goal was clear: force Iran to surrender economically, diplomatically, maybe even politically. But Iran didn't fold. Instead, it adapted. Iran's strategy has never relied solely on direct confrontation. Instead, it has become a master of asymmetric warfare. Across the Middle East, Iran built a network of proxy forces, groups ideologically aligned or financially supported by Tehran. They operated in the shadows, often doing what Iran could not do openly. In Lebanon, the militia and political group Hezbollah served as Iran's longest-standing proxy. In Iraq, Iranian-backed Shia militias gained political and military influence after the US invasion. In 2003, in Yemen, the Houthi rebels, supported by Iran, fought against a Saudi-led coalition backed by the US for Washington. This was Iran's long game. Indirect attacks, denied responsibility, maximum reach with minimal fingerprints. And then, in early 2020, everything changed with a single drone strike. January 3rd, 2020. Baghdad International Airport. A convoy of vehicles pulls onto the tarmac. Inside one of the cars is General Qasem Soleimani, commander of Iran's elite coups force, the overseas arm of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. 2. Iran. He was a national hero. To America, he was a shadowy figure responsible for hundreds of U.S. troop deaths during the Iraq War and for orchestrating Iran's proxy strategies across the region. A U.S. Reaper drone circled above, and then it struck. Soleimani was killed instantly. Also killed Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes, an Iraqi militia leader aligned with Iran. The world froze. Iran vowed revenge. 5 days later, on January 8, 2020, Iran launched a series of ballistic missiles at 2 U.S. military bases in Iraq. No American lives were lost, but more than 100 troops suffered traumatic brain injuries. The world held its breath. Would the U.S. respond? Would this spiral into open war? But then a restraint. The Trump administration de-escalated. Iran mourned Soleimani with massive funerals, and both sides pulled back barely. Yet, behind the scenes, cyber attacks increased. Intelligence networks were disrupted, and the war of words never stopped. Later that same year, another blow. Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, a top Iranian nuclear scientist described as the architect of Iran's past nuclear weapons ambitions, was assassinated near Tehran. Iran blamed Israel, likely with U.S. coordination. The hit was surgical, sophisticated, possibly carried out using remote-controlled weapons and satellite support. 2. Tehran. This wasn't just an attack on a scientist. It was an insult to its sovereignty, a signal. We know where your red lines are, and we'll cross them. Yet again, Iran promised revenge. Yet again, tensions mounted. In 2021, Joe Biden entered the White House. His administration signaled a shift and interest in returning to diplomacy. Talks resumed in Vienna to revive the 2015 nuclear deal. But things weren't as simple as before. Iran had expanded its enrichment to higher levels. New, hardline leadership had taken office in Tehran, and trust, it was nearly non-existent. Years of hostility, sabotage, and shifting leadership had made progress difficult. Some steps were made. Concessions were discussed. But the deal never returned to full form, and the sense grew that maybe the opportunity had already passed. While governments clashed, the real price was paid by ordinary Iranians. Under crushing U.S. sanctions, Iran's economy spiraled. Inflation soared past 40%. Medicine became scarce. Food prices skyrocketed. Unemployment, corruption, censorship. The frustration boiled over. Protests erupted across Iran in 2017, in 2019, and again in 2022 after the death of Mahsa Amini, a young woman arrested by the morality police. These protests weren't just about the economy. They were about freedom, about the rights of women, about generations tired of being caught in the middle of a fight they didn't choose. And yet, the regime cracked down .arrests, .violence, executions. Outside, the US voiced support for the protesters. But inside Iran, many saw it as hypocrisy from a nation that once helped destroy their democracy in 1953. The scars were still there, still bleeding. This is no ordinary conflict. It's not just about policy or presidents. It's about history, wounds layered on top of wounds. A CIA coup, an embassy siege, war by proxy, nuclear fears, cyber sabotage, assassinations, protests in the streets, and through it all, a question lingers like smoke over the desert. What would it take for America and Iran to break the cycle? From the outside, the hostility between the US and Iran seems absolute. But behind closed doors, not every chapter of this story has been written in black and white over the years. There have been moments quiet, brief, often secret where cooperation did occur, strange alignments, common enemies, shared threats. Because in the real world of geopolitics, there are no permanent friends, only permanent interests. After the September 11th attacks, the US launched Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. The Taliban fell quickly, and surprising to many, Iran played a role. They provided intelligence. They backed anti-Taliban factions. They even helped form the first post-Taliban government in Kabul. US diplomats and Iranian envoys sat at the same table in Bonn, Germany, working toward a new Afghanistan. It could have been the beginning of something new. But then came the axis of evil speech in early 2002. And whatever goodwill existed, vanished. Iranian cooperation froze. Hardliners took the upper hand in Tehran, and the path forward snapped shut. A decade later, another shared threat emerged: ISIS. As the so-called Islamic State swept through Iraq and Syria in 2014, both the United States and Iran had reason to worry. Iran feared instability on its border and the fall of its allies in Iraq and Syria. The US feared a new terrorist caliphate that could inspire attacks worldwide. And so, once again, both nations fought the same enemy, often just miles apart. In Iraq, US airstrikes hammered ISIS positions from above. On the ground, Iran-backed militias and advisors held the line. There was no official alliance, no handshake. But make no mistake, they were on the same battlefield, fighting the same war. At its core, the US-Iran conflict isn't just about the past. It's about the future and who gets to shape it. The United States wants a Middle East that aligns with Western democratic values, maintains open markets, and respects international norms. Iran, on the other hand, sees itself as a defender of the oppressed, especially Muslims, against Western hegemony. It views the US as an imperial power that overthrows governments, fuels wars, and imposes its will. This fundamental clash of visions fuels nearly every confrontation. In Syria, the US-backed rebels, Iran-backed Assad. In Lebanon, the US supports the Lebanese army, Iran backs Hezbollah. In Yemen, the US supports Saudi efforts, Iran supports the Houthis. Neither side trusts the other's intentions. Both claim to be defending peace, and both often escalate conflict in the name of stability. By the 2010s, a new battlefield emerged, one that didn't involve soldiers or missiles: cyber warfare. In 2010, A computer worm known as Stuxnet struck Iran's Natanz nuclear facility. It destroyed over 1,000 centrifuges, setting Iran's program back by years. It was one of the most sophisticated cyber attacks in history. Experts widely believe it was a joint US-Israeli operation. Iran responded in kind. State-sponsored Iranian hackers have launched cyber attacks on American banks, critical infrastructure, private corporations. In 2012, Saudi Aramco, the world's largest oil company, was hit by a devastating virus called Shamoon, which wiped data from 30,000 computers. It was widely attributed to Iran. The front lines had moved from deserts and airbases to servers and algorithms. A digital war now runs in parallel to the political one. While the weapons have evolved, one tactic has remained central to US policy: sanctions. Across every administration, Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, and even Biden's sanctions have been used as the tool of choice. Over the years, they've targeted Iranian banks, oil exports, shipping companies, the Revolutionary Guard Corps, individual officials. The idea: apply economic pressure until Iran changes course. But Iran has adapted. It forged deeper ties with China and Russia. It developed smuggling routes through neighboring countries. And it leaned heavily on state-owned companies and underground networks. Meanwhile, the Iranian people continued to bear the weight, struggling to afford food, medicine, and electricity. And yet, the regime endured. Sanctions have isolated Iran, but they've also strengthened its resolve. For nearly a century, Iran and the US have danced between diplomacy and disaster. Their history is long, layered, and haunted by betrayal, from Operation Ajax to assassinations, secret deals, and proxy wars. There have been chances, real ones, for peace, but they have slipped through clenched fists. For most nations, enemies come and go. Conflicts burn hot, then burn out. But for Iran and the United States, the fire has never truly gone cold. Even when the guns fall silent, even when diplomats sit across polished tables, the memory of betrayal lingers. 1953. The coup that ended a democracy. 1979. The embassy seizure that shattered American pride. 2020. A drone strike in Baghdad that nearly triggered war. Each moment stacks atop the last, forming a tower of mistrust. And yet, in that tower, there are cracks. Cracks where something new might still grow. Today, over 60% of Iran's population is under the age of 30. They weren't alive during the revolution. They don't remember the hostage crisis. They've grown up in a world shaped by sanctions, surveillance, and suppression. But they are online. They're educated, connected, vocal. They want freedom. They want opportunity. Many want peace with the West, not war. In 2022 and 2023, as protests filled the streets following the death of Mahsa Amini, these young Iranians risked everything to demand change, not just from their government, but from the world. And while the regime cracked down, something changed. The world listened. The truth moved faster than the censors could keep up. the chants in the streets echoed across continents. And even in the face of tear gas, beatings, and arrests, they did not stop. Meanwhile, in the United States, public opinion has shifted. After decades of war in the Middle East, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Americans are weary. There's less appetite for conflict, more skepticism toward foreign interventions, and a growing realization that some wounds require more than pressure, they require understanding. In recent years, some American officials have quietly acknowledged that Operation Ajax, the 1953 coup, was a mistake. Others have suggested that talking, not punishing, might be the only way forward. But in Washington, as in Tehran, the road to peace is steep and paved with politics. So where does it go from here? Will Iran and the United States remain frozen in enmity, forever circling, forever striking? Or is there a future where both sides step away from history and towards something new? The truth is, the story isn't finished. Not by the leaders, not by the governments, not even by history books. It's still being written. By the protester risking arrest in Tehran, by the diplomat advocating for dialogue in Vienna, by the student in Los Angeles studying Persian poetry to understand where it all began. Each step matters, each voice counts, and in time, perhaps, the next chapter won't be written in anger, but in reconciliation. We began this journey in the shadows of 1953, where a quiet coup shifted the course of nations. And we end here, in the present, still tense, still complicated, but still full of possibility. Because if history has taught us anything, it's that enemies can become allies, and the deepest divides can sometimes lead to the most unexpected bridges. This has been the Bone Report, where truth is uncovered, one forgotten layer at a time. If this story moved you, taught you, or made you see the world a little differently, like, share, and subscribe. There's more history beneath the surface, and you won't want to miss what comes next.